new guy in our friend group kept pushing drinks on me even after I told him 4 times I don't drink. Turns out he had dropped a crushed pill into my glass and was planning on taking me home one way or another. Just take the shot, don't be weird about it. I don't drink, I said, sliding the glass back across the bar to him. Bryce had been part of our group for 3 weeks. Imani brought him in after meeting him at a networking thing. He laughed off my refusal and ordered another round anyway. 4 shots lined up on the bar even though only 3 of us were drinking. I didn't drink. Everyone in the group knew I didn't drink. I'd told Bryce twice already that night, once at the first bar at 10:15, and once when we walked into this one. He kept ordering them anyway. 1 shot won't kill you, man. He pushed the glass back toward me and I pushed it back to him. Jorge, the bartender, who I'd been here enough times to recognize, watched without saying anything. I figured Bryce would give up. He didn't. At one point he ordered me a tequila shot, which he knew I'd never drink because I'd told him at the first bar that tequila made me sick. He set it down anyway and said, maybe this is the one that turns you. Then he clapped me on the shoulder hard enough that I felt it the next morning. The 4th time I told him plainly that I didn't drink alcohol, period, no exceptions, and he said he respected that, and then ordered me a Long Island iced tea and put it in my hand. By 11:40 he'd ordered me 4 drinks I hadn't asked for. 2 beers, a vodka soda, another shot. He kept sliding them over with this grin like we were both in on a joke. When I didn't respond, he'd call me a wuss and then catch himself and say he was kidding. Don't be weird about it. That was his line. He must have said it 6 or 7 times before midnight. When Imani came back from the dance floor, he tried to make it a group thing. Tell him to loosen up. Imani rolled her eyes and said, leave him alone. He doesn't drink. Bryce nodded like he agreed and then ordered me another vodka soda the second she walked away. I went to the bathroom around 12:05 just to get a break, and when I came back, there was a fresh drink at my spot. Bryce was at the other end of the bar talking to Renata. I sat down and didn't touch it. Jorge came over and started wiping the counter near me, though it was already clean. He leaned in. Don't drink that one. He said it quietly without looking at me. I asked what he meant. He said the guy you came in with put something in it. Jorge had been watching for the last hour. He'd seen Bryce drop something into the first vodka soda too, the one I'd pushed back, but he hadn't been sure until the second time. A pill, crushed up, powder going in when Bryce thought no one was looking. I asked him if he was sure. He said he'd worked here for 9 years, and he knew what crushed up pills looked like going into a glass. He said he was about to call his manager. I sat there for a second trying to fit this into something I understood. Bryce was the new guy. He'd known me 3 weeks. We had no history, no problems. He had no reason to want me in any particular state. That was the part I couldn't square. People drug strangers for predictable reasons, and I wasn't a stranger, and none of those reasons fit. I asked Jorge to hold off for a minute. I went over to Imani and asked her to come outside. She didn't want to leave at first, but I told her it mattered. Renata came too. Once we were on the sidewalk, I told them what Jorge had said. Imani went still. She didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. That's when Imani told us about Bryce. She'd known him for 2 years. They'd dated briefly in grad school, and it had ended badly enough that she'd moved apartments. He'd shown up at her job in October pretending it was a coincidence and asked her to grab coffee. She said yes because she was scared not to. He kept finding reasons to come by, lunch invites, an alumni thing they were both supposedly part of. By the time he asked her to introduce him to her friends, she'd had coffee with him 4 or 5 times against her own judgment. She thought if she let him meet us in a group with witnesses, he'd realize she'd moved on. She thought making him a friend would be safer than making him an enemy. She'd been wrong about that. She apologized to me 3 times in about 90 seconds. When we walked back in, my glass was gone from the bar. Bryce was at the other end now, leaning close to a woman I didn't recognize, his hand low on her back, and she was lifting that same vodka shot to her mouth. I didn't have time to think. I knew if I shouted across the bar, Bryce would have time to spin whatever story he wanted. So I walked fast, cutting through the crowd, keeping my eyes on that glass. Renata was right behind me. I got to her just as the rim of the glass touched her bottom lip. I reached out and put my hand on her arm, gentle but firm. Don't drink that, I said. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Her eyes went wide, and she pulled the glass back from her mouth but didn't set it down. Bryce stepped right between us, smooth as anything, that big, easy smile plastered across his face. Bro, what are you doing? You're scaring her. He said it with a little laugh, like I was the one acting strange. The woman pulled back a step, confused. I could tell she was leaning toward believing him because he looked calm, and I probably looked like a crazy person who'd just rushed across a bar to grab a stranger's arm. I didn't care how I looked. I looked her right in the face and said, he put something in that drink. The bartender saw it. Bryce laughed. It was loud and big and completely fake. He's been drinking all night. He's wasted. I'm sorry about him, Bryce said, shaking his head like he was embarrassed on my behalf. The woman looked down at the glass. She looked at Bryce. She looked back at me. She still hadn't put it down. That's when Renata showed up at my shoulder. She looked at the woman and said, I'm his friend. He doesn't drink. He's completely sober. Please put the glass down. Whatever it was, the woman finally set the glass down on the bar. She let go of it like it was hot. The second the glass left her hand, I watched Bryce's smile drop, just for half a second. It was like watching a mask slip before someone catches it and puts it back on. He caught himself fast and said, this is insane. You guys are embarrassing yourselves. He turned back to the woman and put his arm around her shoulder, casual, like they were old friends. Let's go somewhere quieter. These people are being ridiculous, he said, already trying to steer her away. That was the moment everything clicked. He wasn't just saving face. He was trying to leave with her. I stepped directly in front of them. You're not leaving with her, I said. Bryce's whole face changed. The charm fell off like a coat he'd been wearing over something uglier. He stepped close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. Back off, man, he said, low and hard. You don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't a request. It was a threat. The energy around us shifted completely. I could feel the people at the nearby tables turning their heads. Conversations got quieter. Someone at the booth to our left stopped mid-sentence. It was one of those moments where a whole room figures out something is happening and everyone goes still at the same time. I didn't back up. I didn't move. He was maybe 2 inches from my face and I could see something behind his eyes that I hadn't seen all night. Something mean and calculating and not at all surprised by what was happening. Like he'd been in this spot before. Like he had a playbook for this. Then Jorge came around from behind the bar. He looked at the woman and said, ma'am, I need to take that glass. I saw what happened and I've already called my manager. The woman stepped away from Bryce. She moved toward Jorge like he was the safest person in the room. She asked him what he saw. Jorge didn't flinch. flinch. He kept his eyes on the woman and said, I watched him crush something up and drop it into that drink while his friend was in the bathroom. Bryce pointed at Jorge and said, that's a lie. But his voice cracked. Just enough that the woman heard it and took another step away from him. Just enough that I knew the story he'd been telling all night was falling apart. Bryce was cornered, but he wasn't done. He backed up a step, put his hands in his pockets, and I could see him calculating. He kept glancing toward the exit, then toward Imani, who had just walked back inside. Renata pulled up next to me and whispered, Jorge's manager is on the phone with someone. I think they're calling the cops. Good. But Bryce was already working on a new angle. He turned toward Imani with that same easy grin and said her name like they were old friends. I could see her flinch from 10 feet away. Bryce started walking toward Imani. Slow, easy, like he was approaching a friend at a party. When he got close enough for her to hear, he said, Imani, tell them I'm not like that. You know me. We go way back. His voice was warm, almost gentle. And I'm going to be honest, for a second it worked. The whole room kind of paused. Imani froze. She looked at the floor, her shoulders pulled in tight like she was trying to make herself smaller. Watching her stand there like that, I realized something that made my skin crawl. Bryce had done this before. Not just the drugging, this exact move. He'd used her fear to keep her quiet, probably for a long time. He knew that if he got soft with her, she would fold. I stepped between them. Don't talk to her, I said. Bryce didn't even glance at me. He looked right past my shoulder, kept his eyes locked on Imani, and said, you invited me here, remember? You wanted me around. Tell them. Imani's hands were shaking at her sides. Renata moved in and put her arm around Imani's shoulder. You don't owe him anything, she said, quiet, just for her. Imani stood there for what felt like a long time. I could see her jaw working, like she was chewing on words she wasn't sure she could say out loud. Then she looked up at Bryce, and she said, I invited you because I was afraid of what you'd do if I didn't. The words came out quiet but clear. Every single one of them landed. Bryce blinked, and then the charm dropped. All of it. His face went flat. His jaw tightened. That's ridiculous, he said. You're making stuff up because your friends are paranoid. His voice had gone flat and cold. Nothing like the friendly guy from 10 minutes ago. The woman who had set the glass down spoke up. Wait, you two dated? Imani looked at her and nodded. The woman's face changed. There was something in her expression that I recognized. That moment when you realize someone has been lying to you about something basic, and you start wondering what else they lied about. She turned to Bryce. You told me you didn't know anyone here. You said you came alone. The words hit the air and just sat there. Bryce opened his mouth and for a second nothing came out. Then he tried to recover. I barely know her. It was nothing. He said it fast. The way people talk when they're scrambling to patch a story that's falling apart in real time. The woman didn't buy it. She didn't even think about it. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts disgust and something deeper. Something like the sick feeling you get when you realize you were 30 seconds away from being someone's victim. She backed away from him and said, don't talk to me. She said it firm and final and didn't look at him again after that. She turned toward Jorge and put her back to Bryce like he didn't exist anymore. That's when the door to the back opened and Jorge's manager came out. He walked straight over to Bryce and said, sir, I need you to stay right where you are. Bryce let out a nervous laugh. For what? Because some bartender made up a story? The manager didn't react. He just stood there with his hands at his sides and said, we have cameras behind the bar. We already pulled the footage. The silence that followed those words was the loudest thing I'd heard all night. Bryce's mouth opened. Then it closed. For the first time since I'd met him 3 weeks ago, Bryce had absolutely nothing to say. Then Bryce did something I didn't expect. He shifted. The anger drained out of him like someone had pulled a plug. His shoulders dropped. His eyes got glassy. He looked past me at Imani and his voice was soft and small and sounded like a person who was genuinely hurt. After everything we went through, he said, you're gonna let them do this to me? His voice cracked right at the end. Just enough to make you pause. Just enough to make you think maybe there was another side to this. And for one terrible second, it worked. Imani's face changed. The firm expression she'd had started to soften. I could see guilt creep across her face like a shadow. He knew her better than I did. He knew that guilt was her weak spot, that she'd blame herself before she'd blame anyone else, that all he had to do was look wounded, and she'd start wondering if she was the one who'd done something wrong. Imani took a step toward Bryce. Renata grabbed her arm, just enough to say stop, but Imani was already talking. Maybe we should just talk to him outside, she said. Her voice had gone shaky. Maybe there's an explanation. There's no explanation for drugging someone's drink, I said, but Imani was spiraling. I shouldn't have brought him into the group, she said, mostly to herself. This is my fault. Bryce saw the opening and pushed right into it. He took a step closer. You know me, Imani, he said, barely above a whisper. You know this isn't who I am. Someone's trying to set me up. And then he reached for her hand. Don't touch her, I said. The words came out clear and hard, and Bryce pulled his hand back, but the damage was already done. Imani was crying. Real crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and old. 2 years of fear and guilt and confusion was pulling her under right there in front of everyone. She sat down on the bar stool behind her like her legs had decided they were done holding her up. I kneeled down next to her so I was level with her. You moved apartments because of him, I said, quiet and clear. Just facts. You said yes to coffee because you were scared. That's not a friendship. That's not someone who deserves the benefit of the doubt. She sat there with her hands pressed against her face. Then she wiped her face with both hands. She sniffed once, hard, and she nodded, slowly, like each nod cost her something. She turned on the bar stool until she was facing Bryce. He was standing about 6 feet away, still holding that wounded expression, still waiting for her to fold. She looked at him and said, I'm done being scared of you. She said it the way someone says something they've been practicing in their head for years without ever believing they'd actually say it out loud. Bryce's face changed. The soft act collapsed. The glassy eyes went hard. His jaw locked, and he said, you'll regret this. All of you will. He said it flat, no emotion, just a promise delivered the way someone delivers a threat they fully intend to keep. Then Jorge stepped forward. The police are on their way. You should probably stop talking. Bryce's whole body went tight. His hands balled into fists. For a second, I thought he was going to swing at someone. Instead, he kicked over a bar stool. It hit the floor with a loud crack that made half the bar jump. Then he turned and headed straight for the door. The manager stepped out and moved to block the exit. He didn't say a word. He just stood there with his feet set wide, filling up the space like a wall. 2 other patrons who'd been watching from a table near the front stood up. They positioned themselves on either side of the doorway like they'd made a decision without needing to talk about it. Bryce stopped. stopped. He was in the middle of the bar, equidistant from the door and the back hallway and the bar itself, and every direction he could go had someone in it who wasn't going to let him pass. He was surrounded, and for the first time all night, the fear on his face was real. Not performed, not calculated. Real fear. The kind that shows up when a person finally realizes that the ground they've been standing on was never solid, and now there's nowhere left to go. He stood there, turning in a slow circle, looking for a gap that didn't exist, and I watched the last bit of control drain out of him like water through a crack. When the front door opened and 2 officers walked in, Bryce tried one last time. He pointed straight at me and opened his mouth, but the manager was already walking toward the officers with a tablet in his hand, footage pulled up and ready. The officers went straight to the manager. He turned the tablet so they could see the screen. One officer leaned in close and watched the footage. Then he watched it again. He straightened up and looked at the manager. Which one put something in the glass? The manager pointed at Bryce. The officer nodded once and walked over. Sit down, he said. This is a misunderstanding, Bryce said, hands up like he was showing he had nothing to hide. The officer didn't move. Sit down. Bryce sat down on the nearest bar stool like his legs had been cut out from under him. The second officer went to Jorge with a notebook. Jorge walked them through everything from the beginning. The first drink, the crushed pill he'd seen Bryce drop in, the second drink waiting at my seat when I came back from the bathroom, and the moment Bryce realized I wasn't going to drink it and moved the glass down the bar to the woman he'd been talking to. Jorge gave times, descriptions. He talked the way someone talks when they've been watching carefully and remembering everything on purpose. Then the officers moved to the woman. She told them Bryce had come up to her while we were outside. He said he was there alone, that he didn't know anyone in the bar, that he'd just wanted to buy her a drink. Then she said something that made every sound in the bar go fuzzy for a second. He told me his name was Brandon. I looked at Bryce. Bryce looked at the floor. A fake name. He had a whole script ready to go, a whole act built from the ground up, with a fake identity and a drink already drugged before he even started talking to her. This wasn't something he came up with on the fly. This was practiced. This was something he'd done before, maybe many times before. I thought about all the bars in all the cities where Bryce had walked up to someone with a drink and a fake name and a smile that made you think he was safe. I thought about the ones who didn't have a Jorge watching from behind the counter. The officers came over to me next. It's like I told them how Bryce had pushed drinks on me all night, even though I'd told him 4 times that I don't drink. How Jorge had warned me. How we'd come back inside and found my glass gone and the same drink in a stranger's hand. Then Imani spoke. Her hands were steady now. She told them about grad school, about dating Bryce and how it ended, how she moved apartments because of him, about him showing up at her job in October, about the coffee she agreed to drink because saying no felt more dangerous than saying yes. When she finished, she looked at the officer and said, I brought him into my friend group because I thought it would keep me safe. I was wrong. Renata confirmed everything. The officer closed his notebook. He walked over to Bryce, still sitting on that bar stool, and said, stand up and put your hands behind your back. Bryce's head came up. His face cycled through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. Disbelief, anger, fear. You can't be serious, he said. I'm serious. Bryce stood up slowly. He put his hands behind his back and the officer put the cuffs on him. The click of those cuffs was the only sound in the bar. They walked Bryce toward the front door. He didn't look at Imani, didn't look at me, didn't look at the woman at the end of the bar. He just walked between the 2 officers with his head down and his wrists locked behind his back. The manager held the door open, and they walked him out into the night. I stood by the window and watched them put him in the back of the car. The lights on top of the car stayed off because there was no rush, no chase, just a man in handcuffs who'd run out of people to fool. Then I turned around. Imani was standing by the bar with her arms crossed tight over her chest. I'm so sorry, she said. Her voice cracked on the word sorry. You didn't do this, I said. He did. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe it yet. The woman from the bar walked over. She looked at me and said, thank you. I would have finished that drink. Then she looked at Imani. It's not your fault. 3 words from a complete stranger, and they hit Imani harder than anything anyone else had said all night. Imani started crying again, but it was different this time. Not the panicked, shaking sobs from before. This was the kind of crying that comes when something tight inside you finally lets go, when someone says the thing you needed to hear, and you believe them because they have no reason to lie. I sat down on the bar stool next to Imani. Renata sat down on the other side. Jorge slid 3 glasses of water across the counter without anyone asking. The bar started to fill back up with normal sounds. Conversations picked up again. Someone put money in the jukebox. The world moved on the way it always does, fast and careless. I sat there and stared at the spot where Bryce had been sitting an hour ago. The stool was empty. The counter was clean. Jorge had wiped it down at some point, wiped away the rings and the water spots and whatever else had been there. There was no evidence that anything had happened at that spot at all. I pulled out my phone. The screen said 12:47. The night was still young for everyone else. I put the phone back in my pocket and stayed right where I was, in the quiet that only comes after something almost went very, very wrong.